All right, well, Department of International Relations and Cooperation Director-General Zane Dangor joins us this evening for more. Zane, good evening to you. So good to have you with us. This was quite the story, I think, is certainly when it broke this morning for journalists who were watching it across the world, I think. But talk to me about whether or not you were expecting to hear this.
Thank you, Annie. Good evening, Naledi. Good evening, my side at least. I do think we were expecting this. I think if one looks at the overwhelming evidence, that there was prima facie evidence of war crimes, crimes against humanity. And from our side, when we referred the situation to the ICC, we also asked for genocide to be considered. We see the chamber has decided on war crimes and crimes against humanity. And we fine with that at this stage because we still have the ICJ case pending. But we were expecting this based on law. We were a little worried about the politics of this. We've seen attacks on the ICC recently by a number of very powerful states. We've seen the attacks on the prosecutor of the ICC. And, knowing, in fact, that these arrest warrants would have become null and void if there was a suspension of the ICC prosecutor. So we were really worried about that from a procedural perspective. But in terms of the substance, we were expecting this.
Yeah.
There's no way that the chamber could not issue these warrants.
And the timing quite significant, isn't it? I mean, I said good evening, but I suppose for you it's still afternoon there because you are in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, where you've been watching very closely as those interactions take place between G20 leaders. We've now, essentially readied ourselves to take over the presidency of the G20. It's going to be a busy year for us. But talk to me about if you're hearing any sort of conversations among those G20 leaders around the response to this matter, the news of the warrant of arrest for the Prime Minister of Israel.
So I think if we look at the declaration of the G20, we didn't specifically talk about the arrest warrants and the criminal issues, but we did talk about Gaza and Palestine. We got agreement from the US and others, to ask for a ceasefire, but to affirm the rights of Palestinians. But also there was an affirmation that all states must respect international law. And ironically, that was actually quite a big debate within the G20, as some states did not want to acknowledge that all states needed to be held accountable for breaches of international law. So there was a sense that this was coming from some states. Yesterday, ironically, I spent some time, following the declaration at the Munich Security Conference, which is being held in Rio for the very first time. And again, we had a significant debate amongst government officials, ministers, about the need for all of us to be held equally accountable. And I think there's an acceptance of this. We, as South Africa, and supported by many other states, did at this conference call out the fact that there is significant double standards, that when there was an arrest warrant for Putin, everybody was asking South Africa and many others to ensure that we certainly stick to our obligations under international law and our own national legislation. And today we're making the same call to all of those states, all state parties, and there's about 123 of them who are members of the Rome Statute, must stick to their obligations and be clear that if either of the people who have arrest warrants issued against them enter into their jurisdiction, they will have to arrest them.
That's going to be something that we watch very closely, because that's been a contentious issue in previous years, particularly, for instance, where our relationship with Russia, for instance, is concerned, and even how the BRICS summit would have played out last year with Vladimir Putin unable to attend physically in South Africa. But I want to do this. These arrest warrants, Benjamin Netanyahu, the former defense minister, Yoav Gallant, but also Hamas military leader Mohammed Al-Masri in that list. And I remember in August in August this year, Dirco condemning the targeted assassination of Hamas leader Dr. Ismail Haniyeh. And there's always been, I suppose, this really difficult conversation around the accusations that have been made around South Africa's relationship with Hamas. So what is your response? And I think it's a great opportunity to clarify where we sit then, in that arrest warrant also issued for that Hamas military leader, Mohammed Al-Masri.
So in November last year, South Africa, together with 5 other countries, referred the situation in Palestine to the ICC. We included in that referral the fact that even the militants who did the attack on October 7th must be investigated for war crimes. Our view is that we recognize the right of oppressed people to fight against oppression in terms of the Geneva Conventions, but they cannot attack civilians. Any attack of civilians, in our view, and in terms of the legal provisions of the ICC, is a war crime. So South Africa's referral included the attacks by Hamas and other militants, but it also included the response from the Israelis following that, which included war crimes, crimes against humanity, and in our own referral asked for genocide to be included in the indictment as well. So we knew, for example, that when these arrest warrants come, that senior leaders of Hamas will be, arrest warrants would be against them. 2 of them have now been killed, extraterritorial, extra judicial executions, also in the territory of other states, and they have not had the opportunity to put their case in front of the ICC. We're hoping that the 3 remaining arrest warrants will allow all 3, including the 2 Israelis and the Hamas leader, to put their case before the courts.
Yeah, as you talk about the process that we embarked on with the ICC and the ICJ as South Africa, I argue, speak for myself and say, I argue that the world then watching the country's foreign relations very, very closely, our foreign relations. I don't know if that's good for our brand, but it certainly has made us more visible on the global scale. And then there's the fact that you've got other countries that have applied for intervention requests in the matter. I mean, what do you think that is meant about, if we really take that as vindication and what has led to with these arrest warrants? Is that something that we see as success on our part? What is it, 14 countries, I believe?
Yes, so on the ICJ case, there's been significant, on the ICJ case, remember the ICJ case, which deals with states, there's been 14 countries that have intervened. And more will intervene as in the coming months. Now that we have filed a memorial, we know that Ireland has indicated now that we filed a memorial, they will also file a memorial at the ICJ case. The ICC process was a little more difficult. We, together with 5 other countries, added to an ongoing investigation that was already opened in 2021. What we found was that even though the jurisdictional issues were settled in 2021, with the court finding that they have jurisdiction over Israel because the state of Palestine is a state party to the Rome Statute, we saw that after we filed our own papers, there was another questioning of the jurisdiction by some states. It was initiated by the UK, who then withdrew that application to challenge jurisdiction once there was a change in government. But by then, the process was in motion and other states were challenging the jurisdiction. The arrest warrants today was accompanied by a finding by the court that, again, they found that the jurisdiction matters hold, and they also ruled against Israel's attempt to block the case on another procedural matter where they argued that South Africa's referral was a new referral and not piggybacking on the Palestinian one of 2021, and therefore they needed to be notified. Again, the court threw that out. So you can see there's a lot of attempts to still shield Israel from accountability at the level of the ICC and the ICJ. At this stage, we haven't seen any state entering the ICJ case to argue on behalf of Israel. It's still early days. They've got a few months more before they file their response to ours. So you may find that some states may want to intervene on behalf of Israel. But just looking at the legal factors and the facts behind our own memorial, it's going to be very difficult for them to do that.
Yeah. And then, of course, you've got reports that U.S., of course, vetoing Security Council's Gaza ceasefire resolution. But I want to do this, because essentially what this comes down to is people's lives, right? And we can talk about the politics and, what the processes look like from a global geopolitical point of view. But for the everyday individual living in Palestine, they want to know that this warrant of arrest is going to impact them and that the onslaught could stop. Are you confident that that could happen?
Well, I think Israel's been acting with such a sense of impunity. I don't think they're going to stop immediately. What this does do, though, is put pressure on those who are aiding and abetting Israel. It does put pressure on the calls for an arms embargo. Remember, there's a UN resolution that was passed unanimously almost. I mean, just a few countries that voted against this, that called for countermeasures against Israel. We do see that this is another step that ends Israel's impunity, and this will put more pressure on those giving them arms to reconsider this, because if, for example, individual criminal liability is now in play, if the ICJ finds that, for example, that genocide is also in play, all those who aid and abet may also be liable for crimes under the Genocide Convention. So, it's not going to lead to an immediate cessation of Israel's attacks, but it does lead to the steps that will take away the impunity that they are currently acting with.
Yeah, well, we're going to leave it there. We really do appreciate your time, DG Zane Dangor there, the Director General for the Department of International Relations and Cooperation, speaking to us from Rio de Janeiro in Brazil.